We're very pleased to have you here with us for this commemoration of the 160th anniversary of Quantrill's raid on Lawrence. At this time, we ask you to silence your cell phones. Today, we remember a tragic and transformative event in our community's history. At dawn on August 21st, 1863, a band of about 450 Confederate guerrillas attacked Lawrence. In the 4 hours that followed, the raiders killed between 150 and 200 men and boys, leveled numerous businesses and homes, and left 85 women widowed and 245 children fatherless. In the wake of this tragedy, survivors mourned their losses and determined to rebuild and bring Lawrence back stronger than ever. From the ashes of the raid rose our city's legacy of determination and resilience. We will begin today's program with a piece written and read by Anthony Boynton, member of the Black Lawrence Artists Collective.
Anthony, are you here? Okay. We'll move on without Anthony.
Perhaps we may close with a reading. Thank you. To commemorate the people, known and unknown, lost in the raid, we hold an annual memorial service in which we ask Lawrence community leaders to read the list of unknown victims. Now I ask our guests to begin the reading.
George J. Albach, Charles R. Allen, Clay Allen, Duncan C. Allison, George Alwis, Charles Anderson, John Anderson, James Argel, Captain George W. Bell, Samuel Bowers, R. Brandt, Joseph Brechtels Bauer, Dennis Burns, Michael Burns, George Burt.
Judge Lewis Carpenter, Charles Clona, Charles Cloud, George W. Coate, Dwight L. Coleman, Mayor George W. Collimore, James Cooper, James F. Cooper, John A. Cornell, P. Cornell, John Lewis Crane, John Daigle, Ralph C. Ditz, Stephen H. Ditz, and Sylvester Delinsky.
Frank Dyer, George Early, Carl Ekman, August Elis, James Eldridge, Frank Ellis, John Engler, Philip Inglesman, John Z. Evans, Lemuel Fillmore, James B. Finley, Edward V. Fitch, Joseph Frank, John Frawley, and Levi Gates.
Levi Gentry, George Gerard, Anthony Geibel, A. Giffler, John B. Gill, Mr. Goldman, John R. Green, Fortune Gregg, Abner Griswold, Dr. Jerome F. Griswold, and Walter B.S. Griswold, Aaron Halderman, Mr. Hanson, Chester D. Hay, and Mr. Hendricks.
Charles Henry, Calvin Hogue, Nathan Holmes, Ben Johnson, M. Johnson, infant son of Peter and Mary Jones, Samuel Jones, George Calmer, Patrick Keefe, Frederick Kimball, William Clares, Frederick Klaus, William Klaus Jr., W.M.R. Cleffer, and Mr. Lambert.
O. Lambert, John W. Laurie, William Laurie, Christian Leonard, Mr. Leonard, Henry Limbach, John Little, Otis Longley, Richard Loomis, Joseph G. Lowe, Michael Macklin, Amos McClellan, Daniel McClelland, and Jacob McFadden.
Mr. McFarland, David Markle, Louis Cass Markle, Samuel Markle, Michael Martin, Robert Martin, Michael Meeky, Dennis Murphy, James Murphy, Thomas Murphy, Thomas Eugene Murtha, W. Nathan, Gottlieb Earl, and Anthony Bolton.
James O'Neill, George Page, Charles Palmer, Daniel Palmer, Asbury Parker, Isaac J. Parker, James Perrine, Jacob Pollock, George Pope, David H. Purington Jr., George Range, Samuel Range, Eloise Reed Miller, Samuel Jeremiah Reel. Charles F. Riggs, Jacob Roach, George N. Sanger, George H. Sargent, Charles Schmidt, Joan Schwab, Charles Smith, Reverend Samuel S. Snyder, John M. Spear Jr., Robert Spear, Henry Stewart, Captain Nathan Stone, Benjamin Stonestreet, Louis Swan.
Simeon M. Thorpe, Josiah C. Trash, E.P. Tritch, David Turk, John Watson Carpenter, John Watson Recruit, William Addison Wall, Mr. White, William T. Williamson, James Wilson, Louis Wise, Andrew J. Woods, and John K. Zimmerman.
We've asked Anthony Boynton of the Black Lawrence Arts Collective to give us an original reading today.
Good morning.
Good morning.
This poem is written from the perspective of someone who recognizes that our history is being whitewashed. History lessons. There will always be two kinds of stories we can tell. We can tell them all. It's our choice. There will always be two stories that we can tell about yesterday that tells us something about who we are today, because the past is indeed present. One story is brave, filled with heroes and ramparts red glare, rising action. It makes for great film. You can cast your favorite white men, play history's favorite white men, and it might warm your heart because it's the stories that we've always told about wars fought over people, won over people and property, on misnamed lands with unnamed names. The other is told by the brave. It's complicated, it's messy, filled with horrors about folks running and hiding from terror, about folks bold enough to protest. It may induce shame, it may induce guilt, but we will be better for it because the story can bear it. A story about freedom struggles born from long summers in the Deep South, from grounds tilled by my ancestors, by sharecroppers from the veins of the bleeding Kansas, with the eerie shine of a golden West Coast. The story is hard to share. The story may be hard to bear, but it is honest. And like a good meal, sharing the story and naming names and bearing gifts, knowing those stories, we will be better for it.
In honor of the known and unknown victims of the raid, we now offer a moment of silence. Thank you for joining us today for this memorial service and helping us honor those whose sacrifice is at the heart of our community and our community's identity, and whose stories are a treasured part of our heritage. And I thank our readers as well. So if you flip over the memorial service program that was on your seat to see the full listing of events for Civil War on the Border, most of those tours have sold out, but some seats are still available. Thanks for joining us today, and I'll just conclude by saying in about 10 minutes, we'll start the next part of our program right here in the community room, a talk by Fred Whitehead, Kansas City historian. So, thanks, everybody. One last note, as you walk about, please be mindful of the cords on either side of the podium. We don't want anyone tripping here. All right, thanks, everybody.
Yeah, that's my home basically.
Take your presentation, bring it up. All right, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you. All right, so I'm very happy to introduce Fred Whitehead, a noted historian of free thought based in Kansas City. He's done a lot of projects over the years. Maybe he can introduce some of those to us before he speaks. And he's going to be speaking on the Union cause in Missouri. So please join me in welcoming Fred Whitehead.
Do I have a clip?
Yes, right. Sorry. Right moves it forward, that moves it back.
Okay. Well, our topic today is perhaps a little unusual, but as you'll see, it's rather important, I think, anyway. When I was a kid growing up in western Kansas, they still taught Kansas history in the schools. I have no idea what the situation is now or if it's even allowed. But I remember reading, or in one of the books was this engraving, and it made a tremendous impression on me because at the right, you see a white man scalping somebody. And that was my introduction to the Border Ruffians. And I thought, what could possibly have led to such a thing? And of course, we learned about Jesse James. We learned about Quantrill's raid. And these Border Ruffians were a pretty scruffy, lot of bandits, actually. This is Bloody Bill Anderson, who was involved in the Quantrill raid. The standard book on those Confederate partisan, guerrillas was Gray Ghost of the Confederacy. Well, anyway, sometime in the mid-1990s, I found myself in the basement of the state capitol in Jefferson City. And there were some glass cases of, the history, displaying history of Missouri. And in one of these glass cases devoted to the Civil War was a small piece of paper that stated, in Missouri during the Civil War, there were 30,000 on the side of the Confederacy and 100,000 on the side of the Union. Well, I was totally thunderstruck because I thought it would be the other way around. So thereafter, I became fascinated to learn who the 100,000 were and to get their story. A large part of this has to do with the German immigrants into Missouri. And they settled, as you can see here, largely along the Missouri River because it reminded them of the Rhineland. And their little town, Herman, and all those towns along the Missouri are still German-American communities. And these Germans played a significant role in their communities. This man became a judge. Friedrich Much became an authority on American grape varieties, and the Mount Pleasant winery in Missouri was founded by his brother. And Friedrich Much later became a state senator in Missouri. Well, St. Louis was the center of most of the German immigrants. And as you can see, towards the top right was the old German district, which was called Bremen. And until a few years ago, well, there was still some of the buildings up there, but most are just totally gone. But it was a very large and cohesive immigrant community. Henry Brockmeyer was one of their leaders. He was actually had an iron foundry in St. Louis, and he later wrote a book about his experiences there. But Brockmeyer was a kind of interesting person. He became part of the Hegelian movement, Hegel being one of the great German philosophers. And the example of Hegel's philosophy extended into St. Louis, Missouri before the Civil War. And they actually Brockmeyer and others founded a new movement, which came to be known as the St. Louis Movement. And Brockmeyer was actually the first person who translated Hegel's logic into English, though it's never been published to this day. Heinrich Bornstein had a newspaper in Paris in 1844, where he published Karl Marx, and his assistant, Carl Louis Bernay, was his editor. And Bernay became the paymaster for the Union Army in St. Louis. Well, there are many important books that study and report this movement in Missouri. This is a classic book by Robert Rombauer. There's a more recent book called Germans for a Free Missouri, as well as this one on German immigrants in the Midwest. This is a book that I edited in 1992, which included part of this story. Well, at the outset of the Civil War in 1861, Claiborne Jackson was governor of Missouri and pro-Confederate. The pro-Confederate forces in St. Louis wanted to seize the United States Arsenal in St. Louis, which is actually still there. But Nathaniel Lyon, who was the chief Union officer in the area, had the contents of the arsenal shipped to Illinois for safety. Meanwhile, these German immigrants, they had rifle companies that were sort of militias that were established in the 1850s. And they, they trained, they marched, and so they were ready to join the Union Army at the outset of the war. They seized Camp Jackson, which is approximately where St. Louis University is today. And then returning to the city, the Confederates were captured, they surrendered. But going back into town, fighting broke out and people were killed on both sides. And it was General Sherman, well, later General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, was present at this fighting. And it was his introduction to what was to come. Well, a couple of officers I might mention. This is Peter Osterhaus, who at the outset of the war was working in a hardware store in St. Louis, and he became a major general in the Union Army and actually participated in the successful assault on Lookout Mountain in Tennessee at the Battle of Chattanooga. Another officer, Joseph Weidemeyer, had known Karl Marx in Germany. He came to St. Louis and he corresponded with Marx and became the colonel of a Union regiment, mostly active in the Ozarks. Well, there were battles all across Missouri and Carthage, Battle of Carthage, and I think this was a battle in Salem, which is part of the Ozarks. And so Missouri became an important arena for conflict right at the beginning of the Civil War and throughout the Civil War. And of course, there were several German regiments from Missouri and Illinois, Indiana, and so forth. Well, moving beyond the Germans, there was, I want to call attention to a rather interesting Union officer named John R. Kelso, who was of Scottish ancestry. He was a teacher, he was a former Methodist minister in Missouri, and he left that, but he joined the Union Army right away. And it said that he was actually kind of a scout, and he often operated on his own. And it said that he would wait by the side of a road for his intended victim to show up. And he would have a pistol in one hand and a book in the other. And he would read the book and shoot the guy and go back to reading his book. So, yeah, this is the book where I read about that particular story. Well, there have been books about the Civil War and the Ozarks and so on. And this is what these Confederate guerrillas looked like in modern painter's season. Well, Kelso was actually elected to Congress from Springfield after the Civil War and served one term. He wrote a book which was published after his death on government. And more recently, there are two books about Kelso's activities in the Civil War, this one, and also a full-scale biography. Curiously enough, after the Confederates were defeated in 1861-62, they moved, the Confederate government of Missouri was in Sherman, Texas. And this is the capital of Missouri, according to the Confederates. Well, anyway, these are some of the battle sites that, down here in Carthage and so on. And probably the most famous German immigrant was Franz Ziegel. And he was one of the leader of the battle down in northwest Arkansas.
P. Ridge.
Pea Ridge, sorry, yeah. This is one of the monuments to Siegel, and this is the Siegel Monument in Forest Park in St. Louis. This is the Osterhaus that I've already showed you. Well, coming around to the story of Price's raid, they came out of Texas and Arkansas, and when they went east, they were actually wanted to take St. Louis, but of course it was too strongly defended, so they started west, and their objective then, which is not generally known, was Fort Leavenworth. But they were stopped at the Battle of Westport in what's now Kansas City, Missouri. And of course, that's, lots of tour markers there and so forth. And this is the kind of where the fighting took place during the Battle of Westport. I think this is in the state capitol in Jeff City. Well, at the defeat of Price's raid, Bloody Bill Anderson was killed by Union officers near Richmond, Missouri. They visited, and they found human scalps tied to the bridle of his horse. So that's how he got the name Bloody Bill Anderson. Well, moving toward the conclusion here, I should mention and give tribute to the African-American troops in Missouri. I'll just go about that's one of the earliest battle that engaged African-American troops was in Island Mountain, Missouri. It's now a state historic, and I have to give credit to the state of Missouri for doing very well by this particular site, which is near Butler, the town of Butler. And this is a mural that's there depicting the fight. They were Kansas African-American troops. They were actually not formally organized by the War Department, but in Kansas, Jim Lane said, we're just going to go ahead and do it anyway. And it was a victory for the Union. This is a statue of an African-American soldier at the courthouse in Butler. And moving to the story of Lincoln University in Jefferson City, it was established by African-American veterans of the Union Army. See depicted here. The last thing I want to note is that out of the St. Louis movement, which Rockmeyer and others started, they started the first journal of philosophy in the United States. And Denton Snyder, who was a part of this, wrote a book on the St. Louis movement. And the last slide is he wrote a book called The American 10 Years' War, which is a rather remarkable book because he states correctly that it began in 1855, of course, right here. And it lasted 10 years, it wasn't the firing on Fort Sumter. It began at B.L.A.C.K and so forth out here. And it's interesting because I mentioned Hegel. It's a book that's written on a Hegelian interpretation of history. So I won't try to get into the intricacies of that. But if you're interested in the philosophical history of the Civil War, I recommend this. Well, anyway, that's a quick tour. I hope it wasn't too confusing. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer. Yes, sir.
Given this division in Missouri, the operation of state government must have been very dysfunctional. True?
Well, the state of Missouri did not secede from the Union. In other words, these Germans came out of St. Louis and they went to Jefferson City and they secured the state government for the Union. Of course, it was divided. But the fact of the matter is, these Confederates retreated to southwest Missouri, and they took the state seal, but that's just a formality, and so they were forced to leave the state and go to Texas. But all civil wars are confusing because they're dividing families and they're dividing communities, and it's hard to forgive after such wars because it's so closely involved. It totally amazed me to learn. I'd always thought that people from Kansas just went over there and walked them. That's part of our myth, part of our legend and lore. But the fact of the matter is that the 100,000 in Missouri for the Union, 30,000 for the Confederates. That's why the Confederates were so ruthless, because they were outnumbered. And they thought, well, if we could beat them, and through determination. And it didn't work.
I guess my question was, since the legislature is divided geographically by Senate districts and House districts, you must have had both Confederate representatives and Union representatives in the state legislature.
Well, their allegiance might be to the South. I mean, as members of the legislature, but the fact of the matter is, once they were outvoted and actually outmaneuvered, the state capitol was captured by Union forces. They didn't really stay around, they left, and but the remnants of them went to Texas. So there was still a factor, and there was still fighting. Near Coal Camp, Missouri, which is just a little town. That was still is a kind of German immigrant town, and there's stories of Confederate guerrillas meeting a farmer on the road and finding out that he was a German, just shooting. So, everything was divided, as civil wars tend to be. Yes, ma'am.
Do you happen to know some examples of Union armies in Missouri that freed enslaved folks who escaped to their camps? They were known as contrabands. I was just curious about the Union troops in Missouri that might have done that, some examples of some stories.
Well, the authority on this is Professor Richard Sheridan.
Right.
Some of you may know, professor of economics at the University of Kansas. And he actually documented the Quantrill raid better than anybody else. And but he has an article in Kansas History on the contrabands.
Right.
And so I read it, but it's been a long time ago. I think it was mostly the Kansas troops who freed the slaves. They were legally free until even after the Emancipation Proclamation, they weren't. But again, the Kansas troops went in there and said, "You come on anyway."
Well, and I was thinking along those lines, but differently, an important way, which were just the crossings of the river by enslaved people as acts of fugitivity, in particular the so-called slave stampede up in
I'm sorry, I can't really quite hear you.
The acts of enslaved people crossing as fugitives the river, particularly in St. Joe, where the so-called slave stampede there is marked on a marker across the river where hundreds of people walk together across the ice of the Missouri River. And I think it was 62 or 63. And it just strikes me that that's a kind of philosophical dimension in a certain way, self-emancipation that kind of autonomous action separate from what the militias were doing and what they were able to do.
Right.
And that would have given, at least sort of intellectual support to those who heard about it, even if it didn't immediately turn into action.
Historians now conclude that there was a lot more self-emancipation going on. People just fled and left in the middle of the night or got across the rivers and so forth. So it was, that was sometimes neglected in the histories of these things. I spent many years, decades actually, involved with the Quindaro Historic Site in Kansas City, Kansas, which I won't try to get into, but that was where there are people living in Quindaro, which is part of KCK, whose ancestors came across the river exactly as you said. So, yeah. Yes, sir.
Could you comment or have any knowledge of what Senator Henderson from Missouri, who proposed that the government pay slave owners to, this was before the Civil War started, but pay slave owners to give up slavery, and they estimated the cost of this type of thing. He was a senator from Missouri, and then ended up, I just wonder what happened to him during, because he was on the, he got the idea from Lincoln, and he had written this up, and it went to the legislature, it was voted down in Missouri, or I guess it went to the federal government, was voted down at some point, as a solution to the slavery issue.
I actually don't know about him. No, I don't know. My favorite senator from Missouri was a guy named George Graham Vest. And if you ever took a class in speech in school, you probably read his famous oration on the dog. And it was about a guy in rural Missouri who killed, there was a dog that was killed. And it's a great tear-jerking. And you can find it on the internet. It's just a page or two, but it's quite a famous oration. And there's actually a statue of the dog in Warrensburg. Missouri is partial to their dogs. Anyway, he served in the United States Congress, then the Confederate Senate, and then went actually elected back to the United States Senate after the Civil War. And in Gustavus Meyer's History of the Great American Fortunes, he's quoted as referring to the shenanigans of the wealthy in Washington, D.C. And he said, when they speak, they lie. When they keep silent, they are stealing. And regardless of Confederate, his one-time Confederate, that was one of the best things I've ever read about Washington. Yes, sir.
We here in Kansas know a lot about cross-border raids and the way the war impacted civilian life. Was that same kind of thing happening across Missouri at the other end of the state, where factions at the civilian level were fighting each other or raiding each other?
Well, I'm not aware of so much of that there as in western Missouri, because St. Louis was held, and they couldn't go there. And of course, it extended into places like St. Charles and so on. So the entire St. Louis area was a Union stronghold, and they had Union militias in all those little places that were kind of keeping track of what was happening. So the Confederates didn't. Along the Missouri River was the highest concentration of slave population, Plant Boonville and places like that. So, I don't think there was so much slavery. I did read in a book called Missouri's Black Heritage, which I think I showed the picture, that in the 18th century, the French imported slaves to work the lead mines of eastern Missouri. Who knew? But I guess I'm kind of wanting to defend Missouri a little bit because of the complicated nature of that place. And it's still that way today, you know. It's, anyway, yeah. Wow.
I was wondering if you know anything about, speaking of this, there's a story that I have read about military from Boonville who protected Columbia during, from Bloody Bill Anderson, and and that's why the MU has the Tigers, because apparently the group of people were Tigers. You know anything about that? I talked to some Missouri MU graduates who thought I was crazy. No, maybe it was nothing to do with that.
Yeah, I've actually heard that too, that the Tigers were a kind of militia unit that defended Columbia on behalf of the Union. But more than that, I don't know. They don't really make a big deal of it over there. In Missouri, there's kind of a weird, we don't want to offend either side, right? Because there's a lot of people on both sides and so forth. But, yes, ma'am.
You know, we know about the border wars, which kind of makes sense to me because you have, you know, Union supporters, anti-slavery people in Kansas and pro-slavery in Missouri. But when you're having these skirmishes within Missouri, what were they hoping to accomplish with that? You know what I mean? I mean, just going between towns and fighting, you know?
I'm not sure what you're at with
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is, you know, like, I understand the pro-slavery, anti-slavery battle that was going on across the borders, you know, because they were trying to get Kansas to be a slave state. But within Missouri, it wasn't just what they were they were fighting the same anti-slavery, pro-slavery thing, but just town by town instead of, yeah. Were they trying to, you know, take over the government? I kind of understand what their overall role was.
Well, once the Confederates failed to hold Jefferson City, which was the seat of state government, the thing went to a kind of lower level of, you know, town to town, neighborhood to neighbor thing, and that's why I mentioned that, you know, the Germans, they would kill Germans not because they were just kind of generally anti-slavery, and they were kind of generally Union. And the guy might not even have thought, you know, about this, but if they captured him on the road, and they determined from his accent he was German, to shoot him and say, one less, you know, so it was that type of, slavery wasn't definitely involved, but it wasn't always the front issue. It was because who they thought you were in favor of because of your accent. And, there were even guys that were Germans who were captured to try to say that they're actually pro-Confederate. Well, they shot him anyway because the guy was obviously lying. So it's a pretty bad situation all around. Yeah.
I read a lot of railroads in Kansas and not as familiar with the Missouri side, but I gathered that if you were pro-railroad building, they kind of let you go. That was even a more important issue because everybody could enjoy that. You know, and benefits from north and south. I mean, for the upper crust, so to speak.
Well, that's true, but I think one of the battles that wasn't even a battle, it was a massacre at Fayette, Missouri, which was conducted by Bloody Bill, if memory serves. And there was these Union guys were on this train, and the train was stopped, and they boarded the train and took them out and just shot them. So, you know, they didn't destroy the train, but they, you know, they got the people in the, you know, that was the only incident of that I remember. Well, I want to thank you all for such a lively audience.
All right, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you for the rest of the events.